Good afternoon, and welcome to Gulf Coast Creation Care's three-part webinar series for Season of Creation 2020 Jubilee for the Earth. My name is Rhoda Vanderhart. I live in Mobile, Alabama, and am a member of Open Table United Church of Christ, which is one of the founding congregations for this new faith-based Climate Action Alliance. Before I talk about today's session, let me remind you of our next two sessions. On September 20th, we will have a panel discussion between 5 local faith leaders representing Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and Unitarian faith perspectives of creation care. And then on the 27th of September, which is 3 weeks from now, we will have climate activist Anna Jane Joyner and Reverend Michael Malcolm discussing finding courage in the face of climate change. Thank you so much for being here today. We have people who have registered from as far away as California, Texas, England, and Canada, and we appreciate your presence here and your concern and love for our Earth home. I'd like to open with a prayer. O Holy One, may we open our hearts to dream with you of a time when all of humanity will treasure and care for your creation. Amen. We are excited to begin our first session, Transforming Faith, Transforming Earth, presented by our friends from the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. We will begin with a talk by Robin Gottfried, which will be followed by a panel discussion between him and 3 of his colleagues from Sewanee, whom I will introduce later. That will be then followed by a question and answer session. During Robin's talk and the panel discussion, both the question and answer and the chat feature will be available to you, the audience. We ask that you use the chat if you need to ask questions of the event organizers or about Gulf Coast Creation Care, and reserve the question and answer box for any questions that you might have of our panelists. I have placed some additional information in the chat box about Robin, and I will put some additional information about our other panelists for your reference if you would like to know more about them. We anticipate this event will last until 3:15 or maybe a little longer if there are many questions. So let me begin now by introducing our first speaker, and I'm going to have Robin turn his camera on and join us. Dr. Robin Gottfried, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of the South, serves as Director of the Center for Religion and Environment. Long known for his passion for environmental economics and sustainable development, he has conducted research on land use change and forest policy, as well as the economic impacts of development and other economic activity in the US, Costa Rica, and elsewhere. Robin helped spearhead the creation of Sewanee's Environmental Studies program and served as its first chair. He is author of 2 books and numerous articles addressing the interface of social science, eco-theology, and spirituality. He loves to hike and plays classical, Appalachian, and Latin American music. Welcome, Robin. We're so glad to have you with us today.
Rhoda, thank you for your kind introduction. So good to be here with you all. Thank you for taking your time on a Labor Day afternoon to spend this time with us. If we might just pray one moment and ask God's blessing on our little bit of time here together. Do ask God that you would guide my words, guide all our thoughts, help us be receptive to what you're speaking to us today. Make us into your people, transform us and use us to do your will in the world that you love so much. We thank you and praise you. Amen. Well, I guess I'd like to speak to you a little bit about what I see as the key problem in the world we face today. I see, and my colleagues who are with us today at the Center for Religion and Environment see that the key problem we face is the problem of alienation. We're out of relationship with creation and out of relationship with the Spirit of God. Creation for many of us, and increasingly so, is something we see on TV or a webcam. We like it in theory, but we'd rather stay inside with the AC on in our germ-free house. Ronald Rolheiser has worked on or has written on his sense that ever since perhaps the 1600s, 1500s, Western civilization at least has become more and more devoid of an experience presence of the Spirit of God, of the sense that there's something bigger than us and far more profound than just what we see in the world around us. It lacks a sense of the sacred, or as people are saying today, the enchanted. Now, things tend to spin out of control in a community where relationships are in bad shape. There can be a downward spiral that occurs. Things can become increasingly poisoned. We have the example of famous family feuds, dysfunctional communities. If you take a look at our current political and racial problems, we see that happening, unfortunately, in a very strong way. At a university or college, we have lots of interdepartmental and interpersonal feuds. They get in the way of effective education. It makes it difficult for the entire community to prosper when relationships are out of whack. So the question then becomes, could it be that the root of our environmental crises are crises of relationship? Now, I'm going to try to share my screen here, if you'll bear with me a moment. And there we go. Well, now, it's supposed to let me show my slides. Well, aha, there we go. Every time I bring that up, it's different. The Hebrew Bible has a lot to tell us about the effect of bad relationships, of poisoned relationships between people and how that spills out into the land. And Hosea says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel. For the Lord has an indictment against the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or loyalty, and no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing, lying, and murder, and stealing and adultery break out. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who live in it languish, together with the wild animals and the birds of the air. Even the fish of the sea are perishing." All right. So what do we make of this? Well, human beings, I think, are perhaps the only creature in creation that tries to be something, or they try to be something that they aren't. As individuals, we try to be more powerful than we really are, or more beautiful, funnier, wiser, perhaps more likable. And we also try to make others be what we would like them to be when they aren't that. For instance, how many times have you heard somebody say, well, I'll marry Linda and then make her into the woman that I've always wanted to have? Or conversely, George is pretty good, but I'll whip him into shape as soon as we get married. And of course, unfortunately, that approach does generally not work out very well. As a species, we do the same thing. We try to be something that we aren't, and we try to make the rest of creation into something that we wish it were. If we take a look at climate change, rising sea levels, the pandemic, all these things make us realize our vulnerability and our lack of power. We're not rulers. we're coming to realize that we are embedded in a whole world of relationships of which we are only a part. We have been guilty of hubris, of overweening pride, of thinking we can do whatever we want with the rest of our fellow creatures and get away with it. Now we're being cut short. So my thesis is that creation can help us get back in touch with the sacred. It can help us become who we really are as individuals and as a species. And in turn, it can transform the way we deal with the rest of our fellow creatures. Now we, as people, are like sooty diamonds. Each one of us is a sooty diamond. When you have soot on a diamond, that soot prevents light from coming in, from illuminating the interior of the diamond, and then from passing out on the other side where people can appreciate its beauty. We don't shine. We don't bring life and joy to others. We somehow need to learn how to remove the soot. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. I have three parts to the talk. First of all, creation as a spiritual teacher, and then a spiritual, or how creation can help us as a spiritual practice to become who we are. And then finally, how becoming who we are under the tutelage of God and creation, how we can then transform the world that we live in. So let's talk about creation as a spiritual teacher. Have you ever had a time when you felt deeply moved in creation or deeply touched? How many of you feel closer to God, or however you want to name God, the divine, the spirit, the one? How many of you feel closer to God in creation than in buildings, perhaps even your churches or synagogues or mosques? Well, you're not alone. I'm going to share my screen here again. Job, for instance, talks about this. Job says, "But ask the animals, and they will teach you. The birds of the air, and they will tell you. Ask plants of the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every living thing, and the breath of every human being." St. Paul echoes much the same sort of sentiment from Romans. Ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. Martin Luther. God writes the gospel not in the Bible alone, but also on trees and in flowers and clouds and stars. Dogen Keegan, the Zen master. The ocean speaks and the mountains have tongues. That is the everyday speech of the Buddha. If you can speak and hear such words, you are one who truly comprehends the universe. So the question then becomes, can we really know and love God if we don't really know and love God's creation? Or conversely, is it possible to fully know and love creation if we don't really know and love God? Classic monastic formation believed that you needed to love both creation and God in order to know each other. This formation had two phases preparatory to what we might call a face-to-face encounter with God. The two parts of this formation were asceticism and natural contemplation. Asceticism, sometimes when I hear that word, I think of somebody going around and beating themselves on the back with brush and doing some wearing sackcloth and ashes, but that's not what it's really about. Asceticism has to do with becoming more and more godlike in our attitudes and our behavior, learning to be grateful, learning to be humble, learning to be open to others and appreciating others, learning to be reverent. This was asceticism. And so there were practices that monks would use and still do to learn how to become more godlike in their attitudes and behavior. And then there was natural contemplation, or what we would call contemplation of nature or contemplation of creation. The idea there was that you would encounter God in creation. Creation would teach you and teach you about yourself and about God, and then you could work that in with your asceticism, your growth in attitudes and behavior. Now, there were debates about which came first. Was it maybe you had to be more and more godlike before you could even be ready to contemplate nature, whereas others disagreed and said, no, contemplating nature is the first step to enable you to become more and more holy, more and more godlike. And then, of course, there was the camp that said that the two work together and they complement one another. And our center, our Living in an Icon program, takes that third approach. We do it simultaneously, and we found wonderful fruit from having done that. Now, Thomas Merton, as you may be aware, is one of the giants of spirituality in the 20th century. Lived up the road from us here in Tennessee. He lived up in Kentucky, Gethsemane Monastery. And he was the monastery forester, and he was also the novice master for the young monks that were under his care. And in the 1950s, he said at that time that one of his novices' biggest problems in helping form them and in growing and becoming a more and more spiritual person was that they lacked the experience of natural contemplation. They didn't know what it was to be outside. They didn't know how to contemplate it and how to engage God in creation. Now, if that was so in the 1950s, in the 2020s, what is our situation now? I would think it's bound to be far worse. We're used to relating to each other more and more on screens. Here we are on screens, and I can't even see your faces here. Or we text one another all the time, and all too often we see families at tables texting, or people in meeting texting one another. And so we've become more and more alienated from one another. Creation teaches us. It helps us become who we really are. We need it more and more now than we ever did before. When we're in creation, it helps remove the soot that impedes God's light from entering us, from illuminating us from within, and then passing out and shining light onto the rest of the world. So how do we discover who we are? And how do we remove the soot from us diamonds in the rough? Well, this brings us to the second part of the talk on how encountering creation can be a spiritual practice. And I see basically 6 fundamental steps. And here's where I'm going to share the screen one last time. Well, there are 6 steps: reorienting, opening ourselves to the Spirit's presence, noticing, responding to what we see, reflecting on what we encounter, and allowing the Spirit to change us. So let's go through these just briefly. If we really wanted to get into this, that's the topic for another session or more than that. Reorienting. This is when we go out into nature, out into creation, and I notice that I use the word creation because nature implies that it's something separate from us. But there's only God and everything that God made. We're part of creation. So I use that word. When we go out into creation, we need to reorient ourselves, understand why we're going out. I'm going to go out and I'm going to have an encounter with somebody. And so when you go to meet somebody, a friend, you're going to have some coffee with masks on or off, however that is. You go with the understanding, I'm going to spend some time with them and communicate. That's reorienting oneself. And so we need to do that when we go outside. Then we need to open ourselves to the Spirit's presence. We have to say, God, I understand that you're here. I understand that you're all around me, and that you may speak to me in some way that I don't know right now. I'm ready. Here I am, Lord. And then you notice what's around you. You wait for something to call your attention. It might be very small. It might be the sky. It might be a plant. It might be a grain of wheat. You don't know. And when you notice it, you engage in a conversation, so to speak, with it. You take time with it and you look at it and you grow to appreciate it. In other words, you respond to what you see. You respond with reverence. You respond with awe. You respond with gratitude. Notice these are all godly behaviors. Once you have had your conversation where you've gone kind of back and forth, maybe no words involved whatsoever, but you're there spending time with this other, you then reflect on what you encounter. What does this mean? What is God speaking to me? What have I learned about myself? What have I learned about that plant? What have I learned about God? And then we take those lessons and we allow the Spirit to change us. And the Spirit will teach us through our going outside, teaching us lessons. And then if we allow these lessons to sink in, we will be transformed as a result. So reorienting, opening ourselves to the Spirit's presence, noticing what's there, responding to what we see, reflecting on what we encounter, and allowing the Spirit to change us. Okay. Now, a couple of examples from my own life, not that I have any particular depth of experience to offer here, but it might be helpful just to have some real life examples. I was a graduate student. I was still trying to do my dissertation. It was a struggle. I took on a full-time teaching job at St. John's University in Minnesota, which is Benedictine, where I was learned a great deal from my brothers and sisters there. And I was struggling with my dissertation. It truly was a fairly awful experience trying to get that thing done. It was an albatross around my neck. I was getting discouraged. And I was driving home from a rather contentious faculty meeting. I was down. I didn't know what was going to happen. Would I ever finish my dissertation? If I didn't, what would happen to my teaching career? What would I do then? On and on and on. And I was driving in the plane going on this flat area. There was the plains driving towards my house. And I looked up from my thoughts, and here was this most amazing sunset perhaps I've ever seen. Purples and oranges and reds. It filled the entire western part of the sky. It was truly intense. And my mouth fell open, and I was truly awestruck. And in that moment, I sensed God speak to me saying that your problems are so small, don't worry about it. I will help you through this. It will all be okay. Even if you don't finish, not to worry. Everything is under control. Just trust me. And from that moment on, although yes, I would worry, I would fret from time to time, my life was different, and I was no longer paralyzed by fear of what might happen if I didn't finish. That was an example of natural contemplation. In this case, God broke through and spoke to me deep within my heart. All experiences aren't like that. Last year, I was walking down the road at night. In the summer particularly, I'll walk down the road at night. It's cooler, fewer bugs and so forth. And I love to see what happens at night. Wonderful things are out at night. So I had my flashlight because you have to look for snakes walking down our country road. I've almost stepped on a copperhead more than once. And I was walking along and saw this toad, a nice big toad. I love toads. They sing. I don't know if you've heard the toad song, but it's gorgeous. And I just have a special place in my heart for toads. And here is this toad sitting in the road, nice fat squatting down. And I was concerned because you see many squashed toads on our road, and cars do come up and down it. So I decided I would just nudge him with my foot, get him to hop over to the shoulder and get out of danger's way. So I nudged him, and he kind of hunkered down more. I nudged him again, and he hunkered down more and more determined to stay where he was, because he knew that where he was where he belonged, where he really needed to be. So then I kind of prodded him, and then he begrudgingly hopped off a little bit, and I did it again, and he finally made it to the shoulder. And as I started leaving, he hopped right back into the middle of the road. So I thought about that, and I noticed this toad, and I thought, well, what does this tell me? I hadn't encountered a toad as stubborn as that ever before. I said, am I like a toad in the road? When God tries to nudge me, God tries to prod me, and God tries to get me out of danger's way, do I obstinately refuse to listen? Do I stay where I am, stuck in my own ways? And then I realized, well, in many ways I do. And many ways we all do. So this is, again, just a small example of what natural contemplation can be like. It takes many forms, but God speaks to us through the things we encounter in creation if we'll let God do so. Now, this spiritual practice changes our relationship with the earth. I'd like to read a little section from Rebecca Wells' Little Altars Everywhere, one of her novels. It's by a child swinging in a swing set. We are swinging high, and when I look down, I see all the ordinary stuff, our brick house, the porch, the tool shed, the back windows, the oil drum barbecue pit, the clothesline, the chinaberry tree. But they are all lit up from inside, so their everyday selves have holy sparks in them. And if people could only see those sparks, they go and kneel in front of them and pray and just feel good. Somehow the whole world looks like little altars everywhere. In the 1999 film American Beauty, a little boy, again a child, sees a plastic bag floating in the air, and this plastic bag floating in the air entrances him. His heart bursts from the beauty of the experience, and he hears an incredibly benevolent force telling him not to be afraid. The experience jolts him into a new life and transforms his sadness and brokenness into so much gratitude for every single day of my stupid little life. Now, Moses had a similar experience in his encounter with the burning bush. He was just going around doing his everyday shepherding of his father-in-law's sheep. He was out probably checking his cell phone and thinking what he was going to do when we got back to camp. And he looks up and he notices this bush burning off to his side there. Now, I've been told by a scholar that burning bushes in that part of the world are not that uncommon, that the shrubs there tend to be filled with creosote, and when you get into very high temperatures, they can combust. So this wasn't a particularly unusual phenomenon, perhaps, for Moses. But what the Bible tells us is that he saw the burning bush, but he noticed something. He noticed the bush wasn't being consumed. And that's what drew his attention. He was already open, he was already looking around, and he saw this unusual thing. So he went over and then encountered the Spirit of God, or the angel speaking to him from the bush, and he took off his shoes because he knew this was a holy encounter. And then he engaged in conversation with God through the medium of this bush. And as a result of that conversation, the history of the world was changed. So our encounters with creation are very important to our spiritual life, and they are very important to the world. Remember that we are part of creation. People are part of creation. God made us along with everything else. And we've only gotten to know a portion of the living community of which we are a part. We encounter God in one another. Now, it says in the gospel, where two or three are centered, there I am in their, where two or three are gathered, there I am in their midst. And this, I believe, holds true whether they are humans that are gathered or non-humans. We are spiritually deprived. We are alienated from a source of God's love and self-communication. So we can grow closer to God by being outside and allowing it to teach us. We can grow closer to creation by growing closer to God. We need to welcome creation into our worshiping communities. After all, these communities are already praising God every day and every moment. Now, my last point that I want to make is that this process of spiritual growth can transform the world. If we all learn to see anew, if we all learn to see little altars everywhere, and to be transformed in the process of doing so, we can ask how this in turn would transform the earth. Well, first of all, when our relationships change, our values and concerns change. So we balk at things like the following. It's common practice to dump our junk into the creeks, whether it be industrial toxins, whether it be garbage, whether it be sediment from our farms or runoff from our roads. And if once we saw that the creek was a vessel, was a place where God is present, where Spirit and the Spirit of God will speak to us, that in some way, shape, or form, it is sacred. well, then we would really not want to dump our effluent or our junk into the creek. And we would seek ways to stop having to do that. We would be hesitant or feel uncomfortable and would want to change if we were growing food with insecticides and herbicides that killed beneficial soil organisms and beneficial insects. This would no longer be acceptable because we'd be seeing that we were killing fellow creatures, kin of ours, that we share kinship under God's benevolent oversight. Every time I went to flip on the light switch, I'd feel hesitant because I'd know that every time I flip it on, I'm tearing down a little bit more of a mountain in West Virginia, or I'm ripping up a little bit more of the aquifer in Wyoming. All these changed values then, all these concerns would give us the motivation to demand different kinds of products, or to ask for our politicians, for our government to do things differently. We would find changes in environmental policies as we vote for people who reflect our renewed concerns. If I were somebody in industry and I was faced with the problem of how am I going to deal with my toxics, I can no longer put it into the creek, it would lead me to seek new technologies that can actually reuse materials or might use materials that can be broken down biologically without harming the environment. We would see new products come out. I've noticed over the last 15 years, whereas say 15 years ago when I went to the grocery store, there were very few organic products. You might even have to go to a special store to find it. Now with the growth in the demand for organic products, our Kroger has a whole huge aisle full of organic products. Things change if our values and our concerns change. We change our consumption patterns, and this has huge impacts on the rest of creation. But true change comes from following the promptings of the Spirit of God. If the environmental crisis is truly one of spiritual alienation, we won't solve it by thinking and acting as if it's up to us to solve the crisis, as opposed to realizing that ultimately only God can save the world. Therefore, we need to ask God to change and guide us in our actions so we're doing what God would have us do. Psalm 127 makes this very clear. It says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord guards the city, the guard keeps watch in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest." Yes, we need to be well-informed and thoughtful so that we might act wisely, but we need to obey the step-by-step guidance of God's Spirit. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths." Now, this advice of realizing it's God who directs everything, it's God who's going to tell us what to do, it reminds me of a well-intentioned, a zealous orchestra where all the members are doing their own thing. So imagine an orchestra at rehearsal. The oboist comes with a Bach sonata. The percussionist comes with a march. The violinist comes with a piece by Prokofiev, and so on and so on. And the conductor has her own score up there with something that she wants to rehearse. And everybody's in a different genre, everybody's in a different key at different tempos, and nobody is tuned up to one another. And everybody's zealously going along and rehearsing. Now, if that's the case, we're going to have cacophony, and although everybody's well-intentioned and really wants to play music, we're going to have nothing short of chaos. On the other hand, if everybody followed the direction of the conductor, playing the piece that she wanted them to play, at the tempo she indicated, with the dynamics she indicated, and with all the nuance she indicates, something magical then happens, and we get something that's transformative for all the people who encounter their joint efforts. Now, if we believe in an active and alive God engaged with the earth that God has made, who loves the earth far more than we can ever imagine, then we need to learn to take God seriously. We need to ask, what is the next step that God wants us to take? Just the next one. And then when we've done that next step, we can ask, well, what's the next step you want me to take? And then the next step, and so forth. We need not fully understand where God is leading. We need only to be obedient and to trust God. To do this, to transform the world, we must allow God to transform us, our communities. That is our great work. Now, in summary, we encounter God in creation, and the more time we spend open to the sacred law in creation, the Spirit forms us there, and we become more and more transparent. There are fewer and fewer impediments to revealing the presence of God, of the sacred in our lives. And as we become more transparent, we in turn develop a stronger relationship with all of creation, whether human or non-human. This affects the way we interact with the rest of creation. We then make choices that reflect our changed values and relationships. We need to learn to proclaim God's glory and love by the way we make things, build houses and cities, grow food, and relate to one another in the workplace and home. We are called to a radical transformation of our lives and of society. We currently are proclaiming an anti-gospel incarnated in the ways we live, making it harder for people to encounter the sacred and endangering the very source of much of our spiritual and physical sustenance. It's time we proclaim a gospel of transformation, of life and hope by the way we live. Now, I'd like to end with a prayer written by Pope Francis from his encyclical Laudato Si. He entitles it, A Prayer for Our Earth. May we all pray this together. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey toward your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. And I have finished, Rhoda.
Okay. Thank you, Robin. I think we're all hungering for a little bit of transformation in our current world. So I am going to now introduce John Gada. So I'm going to ask John to turn on his camera. John Gada is a professor of English emeritus at the University of Connecticut and at Sewanee, where he has also served as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. In his academic teaching and research, he has long reflected on theological topics, on the interplay between imaginative literature and religious faith, and on American environmental literature, addressing works by authors such as Henry Thoreau, Rachel Carson, Wendell Berry, and Marilyn Robinson. He has many publications, and I've listed them in the chat box for you. I'm going to ask Judith to turn on her camera, please. Judith Markland serves as eco-chaplain at the University of the South. Originally from New Hampshire, Judith comes from a family that instilled in her a sense of spirituality and a deep love of the earth. She is currently enrolled in the Master of Arts in Religion and Environment at the School of Theology. Judith is passionate about the intersection of racial and climate justice and is eager to create spaces that allow people to lean into discomfort, stay with the trouble, and grieve our past and present realities. And Jerry, if you could turn your camera on. Reverend Jerry Capel is an ordained Episcopal priest currently serving at St. James Episcopal Church in Shelbyville, Kentucky. He also serves as the Environmental Network Coordinator for Province 4 of the Episcopal Church, as board chair for the Center for Religion and Environment at the University of the South, and as a fellow with Green Faith. Welcome, John, Judith, and Jerry. And I am going to step aside and let the four of you have a discussion.
Thank you. Well, Robin, thank you. What do you think, folks?
Maybe I'd start off with one reflection, if I may. There are many impressions and wise thoughts, Robin, that you've shared with us. And I might just focus on this question of starting with your reflection on the spiritual alienation. We're in a crisis of spiritual alienation, and that is part of the environmental crisis, which is not merely one that involves the geophysical perils and methane and CO2. It certainly involves those things, but it's a matter of faith. So I guess I would just reflect on one point in particular with reference to climate change and some of the writers who interest me briefly, and that is that the crisis of relationships that you talked about, Robin, obviously connect with faith. And by faith, we mean not merely a speculative hypothesis about the existence of something, but about relationship, connection. Certainly the New Testament is concerned with our relation to the living God, as what faith is about. But so it strikes me that the climate crisis is a crisis of faith and spirituality in several regards. And one respect, that going back to Rachel Carson, is that it is by and large invisible, and hence we have climate deniers. You can see some effects, obviously, of climate change, but you're not going to walk out your door and see it in the way that you would see smoke coming out of a polluting smokestack of something of that sort. So I think that the main point I would make on that is that your talk leads me to reflect on is the way in which the climate crisis is a crisis of faith that calls for faith, but it also, as you have described it, it also has the prospect of enlivening faith, particularly the encounters with the natural world that you described. So one last point I'd make, a writer who I think really dramatizes that is Bill McKibben, known to many of you as a climate activist, but in his very first pioneering book in the late 1980s called The End of Nature, he very much fastens on the question of the spiritual challenge and draws prominently on the book of Job, about which he wrote then an entire volume separately, and suggests that the ability to imagine something deeply beyond us, other than us, is the crucial fact here. And if we think that that the natural world is simply a kind of grand shopping mall or aquarium, we're losing that sense of otherness that is fairly crucial. So I think as we reflect on some of these figures who seem to be simply talking about the physical perils, some of them can help us perceive the wider sense. And you may recall, Robin, you and I and some others accompanied Bill McKibben on a hike when he visited Sewanee. And one of the things he wanted to do was go out and be present in the forests and the rest that surrounded us. So
I had forgotten that, John, of our hike with Bill. That was a great time. And I'll just be very short because I don't want to hog the time here, but what you said about faith and trust and invisibility struck me, because just as God is invisible and is mediated to us through other things, so is the climate problem invisible. And one of the reasons we tend to deny the reality of climate change is that we don't trust scientists,
Yes.
right? We now doubt other human beings who up to now we have placed great faith in, that they have a particular kind of knowledge, like a type of knowledge, not all of it, but certain. And yet now that with our trust in them going down the tubes, we don't believe what they say. And so it's again, a breaking of a relationship that we used to have.
That's right. Exactly.
Wow, I have so many thoughts. But I think, John, when Rhoda was reading your bio, Wendell Berry stuck out to me because I love Wendell Berry. And I think he talks exactly like what you were saying about this focus on relationship. And I know he uses the analogy of marriage a lot, but he also talks a lot about membership.
That's right. Absolutely.
Which is, I think, so important. And this sense of there's a sense of responsibility that we have a duty to each other. That membership isn't something to be taken lightly, that you can like float in and out of. It's very intentional.
Yes.
And I think we're seeing that right now, especially with COVID. And I've been seeing a lot of ties between COVID and the climate crisis, especially because COVID is invisible. You have people that are denying COVID, and because it's not tangible and something that you can physically say, oh, look, I think it's very hard for people to wrap their heads around it. And I think, so I'm in several classes at the University of the South, and one of them is a death, dying, and grief class with Dr. Brown, and absolutely incredible. But we have some wonderful discussions in that class in some of the breakout rooms. And one of the questions was, does Sewanee have a duty and an obligation to the surrounding communities and areas around it in terms of helping with the COVID crisis? Like, we've obviously done a lot at the university, right? And that sparked a lot of discussion, because I was like, oh, of course. But even just talking to my classmates, there was not consensus on whether or not we have an obligation to our surrounding areas. And so things that to me seem just natural. Of course, we're in a membership. Of course, we are in relationship with all of creation. I think for a lot of people in the West is not taken for granted. And I think that's exactly going to your point, Robin, that a lot of it is just this, we need a paradigm shift as well. So those are some of my thoughts.
If I could throw in one more thing here, you talk about membership, which I'd love to talk about more, but one thing that Wendell Berry also reinforces is the notion that eco prefix that has to do with ecology, but also economics, and having to do with, for the Greek, oikos, a household. And so the whole household of creation is a model for the relationships that also a human household, hence Care for Creation, fits that notion that you want to clean up in your household. And I think that's a relevant linguistic connection to all of it.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful. And I think also this idea of widening our circles of moral regard, right? Like, who is involved in that? And I think a lot of it has to do with our individualism in the West, and like this sense, in a way, like capitalism, right? That we say very much it's focused on extraction, and that we're not only extracting natural resources, but we're extracting people. And that it's a deeply violent system against both the people and the planet, and that we're somehow able to see, I don't know, I think we somehow are able to distance ourselves, right? There has to be a way in which, in order to do these things to the earth and to other people, extraction-wise, we have to be able to somehow separate and say, oh, they are other. And I think we're seeing that today in so many ways, that we define ourselves in terms of distance from the other, right? Like, I am this because I am not that. And so I think that also comes down a lot to a lack of community, focus on individualism, on every man for himself, and this idea of that we can own things if we discover them, if we're the first there. And I think, I just think that there's a lot, and I think it's really hard. I lately haven't had as much hope, but I think that there's also been some really neat people that are coming forward, especially if you look at Indigenous groups and things that they're talking about. And I think that they and other groups, especially coming from Eastern faith traditions, have a lot to teach us regarding this sense of community, and how do we, I think also just thinking about how we gather and how we abide with each other and how we dwell together is very interesting. So
I might step in with my economist hat on.
oh yes, please do.
Switched hats here, but I used to teach comparative economic systems. I don't even know that we have that discipline anymore, but it was great to talk about socialism and communism and mixed markets and so forth. And we never used the word capitalism, because capitalism is an ideology. It's not an economic system. And it's a lot of fun to think, well, what would a, quote, capitalist, or better put, market economy, market-based economy look like if the people in it were, say, truly moral? What would happen then? Then we wouldn't dump stuff into the creek. We wouldn't exploit people. We would balk at any owning people would be just horrendous, and on and on. It's our morality that puts a fence around our greed and around our self-interest. Our religion at the core is what forms our value system and the worldview that we live in, and tells us what's permissible and not. Now, wherever there's the chance for greed to come in, it's going to show up. And we don't have any corner on the market for greed. I mean, if you look at the former Soviet Union, which is about as uncapitalistic as you could get, on market as you could get, they had even worse environmental problems. And I don't know if they had worse social problems, but they sure had bad ones, you know. And then you look at and Pol Pot in Cambodia, and on and on and on. And so I don't know that there is an economic system that's perfect. I think any system is as good as the people who live in it. And so ultimately, you can make a monarchy work if you had really, really good people in charge. You know, unfortunately, we often haven't had that very often. So once again, I think we would come back to, you know, and the difficulty in social analysis. Well, what's at root? Is it a values problem? Where did the values come from? Was it from the Enlightenment? Was it from our theology? If it's from our theology or from the West, well, why is it that the East took it up so strongly? I mean, on and on and on and on. So is it a problem just of human nature, of our wiring? What is it? So I think that's why our faith is so crucial, because that's at the root of our behaviors, and then we can use those behaviors within any framework, social framework we construct. And market economies have certain advantages and certain real disadvantages, but so does every other one. So then how do we design systems that are godlike? And of course, in Catholic social teaching, that's what they've been trying to do since, well, 1850s, I'd say, something like that, trying to figure that out. And you end up being uncomfortably in no one particular camp.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, go ahead, Jerry.
no, I just hope what people are hearing is something that is kind of an old and ongoing conversation for us at the center, which is that the issue seems to center really more around faith than just about anything else. And I would guess that in this audience of 45 folk, that our tendency has been over the decades that we are a group of people motivated by the environment, and we're wanting our faith communities to help us. And so what we're trying to do is say the environment has a problem. You and the faith community should be motivated to do something about it. And I think what I hear, and I think we talk about this all the time, is that maybe that frame is backwards, and that naming of the problem is also off. That number one, the environment actually will survive. It's us that's at the risk here. But if we would say we have a faith problem as being manifest by the environmental crisis, our real need here is, well, repentance is a good word, but our real need here is to revisit and rename and reorient. That's a word you had there, I think, Robin. To reorient to, to borrow Wendell, the membership, or to rename the universe and our place in it. That's religious work. And so my invitation, I guess, to the folks who are listening, is there something that would help you to reframe the work from, as faith community folks, from trying to recruit the faith community to save the environment to allowing the environmental realities to call us to a conversion, and see where that goes? And does that change how you talk about it, where you talk about it, who talks about it, and so on? So anyway, I'm putting that out there, I guess, as an invitation to conversation.
I would simply affirm, Jerry, it seems to me that they're in a reciprocal relation, that a contemplative awareness, involvement in the natural world enlivens faith, but also that the faith communities have a role to play, which is, I think, what we all share. But I think you're quite right that it's not simply the one over the other, so to speak, but the way in which there's a necessary synergism between those two. I think that's our vision at the Center for Religion and Environment.
Yeah, I would name that there is actually a failed synergism. Yeah, the synergism is not there. That the kinship that people might find in their love for nature and the environment is in some place mostly other than their faith communities, that they're trying to get a faith community who are not their kin to join them in their kinship. And so yeah, I'm agreeing with you and saying yes, and that is a new problem.
Yes, Jerry and John, exactly. Yes, I affirm all of that. And Robin, I thought that was so interesting what you were saying about the system. Like, that's not really, as long as you have good people involved and it's based on good morals, that the avenue isn't as important as we think. And I think that's powerful message for all of us, right? That a lot of us come from various cultural backgrounds, various faith traditions with a lot of different rituals that look very different, but that container, in a sense, doesn't matter as much as to what is inside of it. And what, Jerry, exactly what you're saying, like, what is our faith? And I think that actually, I hadn't thought about it in this way. So while you were talking, I was like, oh, this makes sense. But so I'm the university eco-chaplain. And a lot of this arose out of conversations with people at CRE, and then Alan Doyle, who graduated this past May from the same program I'm doing, who is awesome. And there's other people that have been eco-chaplains in other places, but it's not really very large. But essentially it came from this idea that we have chaplains in various places of crisis and anxiety and stress. Think of, in the hospital. And that currently we're in ecological crisis. And I love what you said, Robin, about a relationship crisis, right? And so how do we approach this, especially in a society I mean, I would say that the US is emotionally constipated. I'm just going to put it out there. But I think in many ways we do not engage with these Jerry, what you're talking about, repentance, and these are emotional, right? These are like, especially when we're grieving and when we're in times of stress, these are emotional times. And so as an eco chaplain, I try to help guide or like aid in that process, although I think I end up doing a lot of it myself. But this sense of that grief and lament is very embodied. And I think we're seeing that now. What's so difficult with COVID is that we're not able to touch people. And so I think exactly what you were talking about, Jerry, is that this is faith, right? We need to work on this. And I think before we can even get to action, which is I think what a lot of us are focused on when it comes to the climate crisis, is we need to first have a period of truth telling, right? Of recognizing, like, what have we done? Where are we? How have our histories affected this? And how do our present realities, where are we, right? And then go into a period of grieving and recognizing whether you have been oppressed, creating space for that, or whether you have been a person of privilege who is complicit in a violent system, and yet we're not really able to step outside of that system, right? And I think that's what CRE is great at, is that I think you all really, or we all provide resources for people to focus on that faith and those like foundational steps to then be able to have sustainable action without some sort of burnout, which I think is what we're seeing a lot right now. So I'm grateful for you all.
We're grateful for you.
I was trying to say.
This is a great conversation, and I hate to interrupt it. I wish we had more time. But there are a couple of really good questions that have popped into the question and answer box, and I'm going to give both of them to you and then go away and let you talk. The first one is specifically to you, Jerry. Somebody in reading your bio is wondering more about Green Faith and your Deeper Green Church initiative, if you could speak to that. And then we have a viewer who is saying, could you please speak to the possibility that our creation story is flawed, that God made man in his image and gave him dominion over the earth and told him to subdue it, and the absence of the feminine in the how this all unfolded, and the emerging importance of the feminine in finding a balanced creation going forward. So with that, I'll let you resume your conversation.
All right, I'll knock that first one out in just a couple of things, and I see Judith just waiting at this. Well, Green Faith is one of the largest and most organized and most effective and most politically leaning faith, interfaith organizations aimed at a large spectrum of climate reality, not climate reality, but environmental issues, and not just climate. So it has as its helm Fletcher Harper, who's an Episcopal priest, and so that religious core is very solid and operating, and they do a ton of training, but they are increasingly showing up, I think, in the world intersections of the political voice, and so on. So I'd say the answer is greenfaith.org. Just go look them up. But those guys and the Interfaith Power and Light, the IPL organizations, are probably just two of the largest, most active, oldest religious interfaith organizations out there. You should look them both up and know what they're doing and pay attention to what they're doing. Deep Green Church, on the other hand, is something I have kind of coined. And so right now it's a slideshow and a few other things. It kind of abides with the Center for Religion and the Environment. It has to do with the very thing we've been talking about, which is we tend to seek to recruit a resistant church to action in behalf of the environment. And that is a model that is just broken on so many levels and does not function. And so what happens is people all the time say, how come these people don't care? How come I can't get them to move? And the truth is, there's just this huge disconnect between the way we practice faith, which gets into the second question, right? Exactly right. Our storytelling is deeply flawed. You know, we must revisit and return actually to biblical strings, threads of deep ecological reality that are completely orthodox and completely biblical. And we must turn up the volume on some and turn down the volume on some of the Enlightenment humanism that has dominated our faith practice. So Deep Green Church is about moving this whole business from an activist edge of the church to its very center of worship and liturgy and prayer. And so that's what that is. Pay attention to us, I guess, on the Center for Religion's website. There is deepgreenfaith.org website. It's very hard to keep those things up. It's so out of date. But anyway, so I think the answers to these things are head to the websites, see what's there, and we'll try to keep them up. All right, I'll stop with that.
Go, Judith.
Oh man, I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I also want to be mindful. But just quickly, yes, that question is wonderful, and I think Jerry spoke a lot about this already. That yes, what narrative are we using, and how important, like how these stories that we tell and these narratives that we hold shape a lot of our actions and our belief systems, and yes, also recognizing that the Bible, and it was written so many times. There's so many things, like I grew up in Sunday school, right? Just being like, oh yes, it's just like the Bible, how it is, just floated down from heaven. And that's, you know, it was one perfect. But recognizing, I've noticed a lot just in seminary that there's a lot of complexities that we don't realize. And I'm sure that, I mean, I'm just thinking now, the history books that we have in the US, there's a lot of stories that are left out. And there's a lot of voices that are not being heard or recognized. And so I'm just curious, I think that's a great question. Why, what are the stories that aren't being told? And what are the stories that aren't being listened to? And I think we can ask ourselves that question today, right? With people and with creation and other creatures. I think there might be some people from New Hampshire on here. So I'm in Kentucky, and I go to St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. And Reed Loy is our wonderful priest, and he had a beautiful sermon right after Overshoot Day, so a few weeks ago. And he had this lovely image of, instead of, like we often say, we are stewards of creation, and he used the image of a midwife. And I thought that was so beautiful, and I think that really ties in the feminine aspect. And yes, the importance of femininity, and I think this idea of care and of holding and of gathering in, which I think is so important. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm curious to hear what Robin and John want to say.
I'm throwing a little bit there, and I'm putting a plug for John's a webinar we're going to be offering this Center for Religion and Environment. The 24th, is it, John? Is that Thursday?
I should know, but I think that's
I think it's Thursday. I think it's the 24th. Where he'll be speaking about different images we have of how humans relate to the rest of creation. And you know, John's great. So I just recommend that to everybody if they want. You just, and but there are kind of two basic streams of theology in Christianity. The one that we kind of are in at the moment, which has a lot of history to it, of course, a lot of cultural artifacts that are embedded in it. But there's a minority one that started perhaps with St. Irenaeus back in the 200s, maybe it was even more 100s, I can't remember exactly where, but it stresses the incarnation over the passion and cross. And that, and of course the Franciscans have taken this up, and it's becoming more and more powerfully enunciated with modern theologians today. But it's an incarnational, relational theology, which I would see as being much more feminine in its approach. But it's the whole notion that God so loved the cosmos. The word there is cosmos. When it says God so loved the world, it's cosmos. God so loved everything that God sent his only son. So first of all, this whole notion of love coming to redeem everything, not just humans. And second of all, and the word became flesh from John, there the word is not human. The word is really flesh, or I don't know how you pronounce it, but sarx in Greek, and basar in Hebrew, which is, the two are considered very close synonyms for one another. And the word there is that God became basically stuffed, to use the translation of our professor emeritus, Chris Bryant here, God became stuffed, became the makings of creation. God united God's self with everything because God is such a mad lover. Catherine of Siena said God is a mad lover. If we thought about how God loves, we would, and if that were a person, we would say a person's mad. Nobody loves like that. Well, that's what God did when the infinite decided to become something also part of the finite. When the potter decided to become a pot. Now, this is, of course, this is Christian theology, but nevertheless, if we're talking about our story, we have forgotten all that, and it's extremely biblical.
Yes, if I could enlarge upon that point, Robin, I think that as we think about stories, narrative, of course, there's a whole lot that one can do by way of interpreting those passages in Genesis, which I won't get into now to open out the fuller implications. But it's also true, as your point, Robin, about noticing not only a burning bush, but noticing the other stories in Scripture. I think perhaps too much proportionately is focused on the first two chapters of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
I've had students who get the first 2 pages of a book and maybe never finish. But of course, the other stories that are crucial, as you were talking about incarnation, that certainly the emphasis in the New Testament, first of all, that creation is ongoing, is not only cosmic, it is ongoing. It happens not only in the first days, however you interpret that, but certainly astronomers tell us stars are still being born, are still being created. I think that's but also that he has on the new creation, which is Paul's, if anyone is in Christ, a new creation. What does the new creation mean? That the mystery of the Christ is cosmic, all embracing, and so that aspect of the story, to talk only about creation as something that happened a long time ago, is this the fuller reality. Those other stories are certainly in Scripture, but they don't get the same emphasis necessarily. And I think that from my Orthodox perspective, it's not a matter of simply going and inventing new stories, but of probing more deeply those already within the faith tradition.
Well, that goes along with what Colin Cornell said a couple of weeks ago in our first webinar that we had, and he was saying in response to basically that same question, he said that that's just the beginning of the book. Well, it really gets exciting once you get into the temple narratives. Start looking at the temple narratives, and that really is where it all develops. God's relationship with creation really comes forth in the temple narratives, and we just focus on the introduction to the book. We don't, in the Hebrew book, we don't even get into the middle of it, you know. And of course, you have the prophets and all. So we have overemphasized the first 2 chapters of this huge book and forgotten to read the rest of it.
Exactly.
We're getting to the place here where we need to wrap up, but I do have one more question. If you could just quickly address it from one of our viewers. How can we move from a problem-solving approach to the climate crisis to a transformational emerging relationship, presence of God, and what God may be leading us to be in creation? And Ellen Sims would like to say that Brock and Parker discovered that the earliest Christian art was set in the garden, not on the cross.
The quickest response, since it needs to be quick, I have about the thing about problem solving is I'm afraid what we need to do is stop being anxious about and crisis centered, which we have learned from the environmental movement, and we need to unlearn it. That's just one of our biggest challenges. We are surrounded by political organizing that's built on crisis and anxiety, and you cannot build faith on those things. And so I'll say that.
I think too, the testimony of another environmental writer, although Leopold is relevant, who in effect says, you can only be moved to save that which you've learned to know and love. Other writers have said something comparable. So I think to answer that question, it's true that we don't want to be consumed by the crisis or problem, or in fact, it won't be effectual. I do think we need to hold on to crisis, but it won't be effectual unless we've developed a sense of deep appreciation. Robin spoke well about that in his personal experience as well. Without that, there can be no imperative to transform anything if you don't care enough about it. So I think love, appreciation, recognition is crucial. You know, otherwise you don't feel you have a crisis. If you don't worry about losing the Arctic National Refuge, if you don't care about it, you're certainly not going to work up any interest in preserving it.
Yeah, just to add real quick, I think in some ways I agree definitely. And I think we've already kind of solved the climate crisis, right? Like we already know what we need to do. We already have all the plans. And at this point, it's like, how do we actually do them? And I think exactly what Jerry and John and Robin have been saying is I think a personal transformation, which then spreads out, right? And I've just noticed I've been going through Robin and with Jerry, the Living in an Icon. And it's all about being close and interacting with your place, which I think goes exactly to Wendell, right? And this idea of where you are and the pocket that you're in, and interact with the creatures there and the people there, and learn about them, listen to them, and then learn to love them. Because I think it's really hard when you learn something. Like I've been seeing spiders now and I don't kill them anymore because I'm like, oh man, like these guys are cool, you know? And it's once you kind of break down that barrier and have a sense of vulnerability and engage, it's really hard to harm those that you've had a connection with. So.
And I'll just add one last word in it, because I know Rhoda may want us to end here, but if I can learn to love spiders, or in my case, greenbriers and ticks, then chances are I can learn to love people who are problematic, people on the other side that obviously don't know what they're doing and have no clue. I can learn to have compassion and love and listen to them. So it's all the piece. But if we go out and learn to love spiders, we might be able to apply that lesson elsewhere.
We're going to have to leave it there. I wish I was sitting in your living room and could continue this conversation over a glass of wine. Robin, John, Judith, and Jerry, thank you all for sharing your presence, your knowledge, and your wisdom with us today. I hope our audience found your message as moving, inspirational, and thought-provoking as I did. Our next session will be the Interfaith Panel of Local Faith Leaders on September 20th. And I'm going to say quickly too, we've put a lot of stuff in the chat box, and if anybody wants to save that information, you can download it to your computer simply by hovering over at the bottom of the chat box. There's a little square with 3 dots in it. If you click on that, there's a thing that pops up that says Save Chat. And if you do that, it'll download your computer, and you'll have all of those nice websites and information that we put in there for you. And one more thing, Gulf Coast Creation Care is doing a trash pickup, a litter pickup for coastal cleanup before our next session on Saturday the 19th. And if anybody wants to participate in that, please let us know. That'll be Saturday morning from 8 to 11 a.m. on the 19th of September. Thank you so much for joining us today. Blessings and peace to all of you for the week ahead.